Hello again everyone, we are once again back in line today, and you'll notice a couple things that are slightly different. Notice the number is actually 052 out of 999. That pops up as well as the second icon here on the bottom once you get at least 52 triangles. So you get mysterious levels. I have not actually gone through these yet, as of yet, but we'll get to that later because today we are going to be going through set I. So without further ado, let's get started. And well, during today's video, I'll be discussing turn-based RPGs and how they relate to games in terms of, because the most popular turn-based RPGs out there are typically known as Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics is another one, which has a good amount of popularity. Let's see. There we go. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is I've been playing a game called Aggros Generations of War, which is recently ported over to the PC. And the thing with turn-based RPGs is that they provide a little more strategy and things of that nature in the combat, but it can be incredibly repetitive playing those games because there's not a lot of room for variety in that kind of combat system. Because with turn-based combat, it's incredibly repetitive in nature. So what you see a lot of the time is that games like those are really hampered by how much variety they can put into a system that is very repetitive and very stagnant. So those kind of games are really determined by just how much you can put into them, from the standpoint of knowing exactly, okay, with this game I'll be able to kind of do this, but only at a certain pace. And what I mean by that is the game is kind of determined by, okay, the combat same is the same, but the different bosses, different fights, whatever may be incorporated into them creates a variety that you won't get otherwise because the combat system is so repetitive in nature. And one of the games that actually pulls this off fairly well, in my opinion, is an MMORPG called Doofus. That's I don't know if some of you might have heard of it or some of you might have played it. But the problem that Doofus runs into is that the game is very determined by grinding. There's a lot of grinding, as the quests that are available for you to do don't really provide that many leveling. You don't really level up by doing quests, which creates the problem that the entire game is a grind, and with the turn-based combat for an RPG, it is incredibly grind heavy. Granted, there's a lot of content with the game, in terms of a lot of different dungeons, a lot of different things around that you can do, but because turn-based combat by nature is so grindy, then you usually see that involved more with strategy games like Civilization 5 or Risk, where the game is all about the strategy involved and doesn't necessarily require a whole bunch of different things in order to make it worthwhile. So that's why you often see those kind of games take more of the turn-based combat into effect, because it's easier for them to have that kind of combat system, but still be fine because that's the nature of the game. It's not necessarily super repetitive over and over. Because I mean, that's the thing with the Aggros games, is a lot of it is just you're pretty much doing the same darn thing over and over with combat, and there's nothing fresh or new, even if you go to even when you go to the new levels, because it's just the combat doesn't get anything, doesn't really gain anything new with those additional levels. Whereas contrast with specifically with Doofus, that I found is that the combat can be very generic and very repetitive, but the amount of content that is added into that allows it to still flow fairly well, because because you get a whole bunch of different things in terms of different dungeons that require different strategies for you to be able to go through and beat. There's a lot of different classes as compared to a lot of the almost cookie cutter kind of style, where you're basically playing a game that doesn't really show much character distinction from character to character. So you're basically looking at a game that's kind of stagnant with almost stagnant with its character design. Not so much from the standpoint of just characters look the same or whatever, but they function fairly similarly in terms of you have your basic kind of class, and there's no real distinct features that make them particularly new or particularly how do I want to put this? Particularly unique from a standpoint of they don't really provide anything new from either character standpoint or from combat perspective, where it's kind of okay, this character is that character, but he does exactly the same thing as all the other bruisers or mages that exist in the game. So that creates a very specific conundrum with those kind of games, where because it is so much repetitive aspects of those games, that they suffer a lot from that, and they're not really able to work past that in order to create something that's completely fresh and new a lot of the time. So that creates so they're really hampered by that kind of combat system. So you see that a little bit more with smaller games or indie games, where they don't have to be all that complex, or they don't have to be all that lengthy. So you're not really the repetitive nature of the combat system, turn-based combat system, doesn't really harp on the game too much in comparison, because it's not as long. You don't have to deal with it as much, and by doing so, you kind of limit the amount of impact that stagnant nature has on the game as a whole, because you don't have to worry about, okay, this game is basically determined by how much combat we can pump into it, and how much of the storyline we have to depend on to make people still want to play the game, because they're basically doing the same thing over and over when they're playing, when they're doing fights or whatever that they have to do in the game. So this Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics, those games are actually fairly short, especially in comparison to their counterparts of the full games. So you see a lot of times where that kind of game doesn't really need a whole bunch of stuff involved in it, because it doesn't need to be super lengthy in nature. It doesn't need to take up a whole bunch of time, because it's just kind of, I don't want to put this, it's just, it basically doesn't have to be a super lengthy thing, because you can still get enough enjoyment out of the game, and it's short enough to where you're not fully impacted by the repetitiveness of the combat. So, in a lot of those times, it's just, that kind of system just works better with turn-based combat. Not turn-based combat, strategy games, where turn-based really incorporates a lot of the strategy, because the main difference with turn-based as opposed to time is that the turn-based really involves a lot more strategy into how you approach the fights. You have to plan ahead a lot more. You have to be prepared for. You have to have contingency plans to be prepared for different things that will pop up, and knowing exactly, okay, this is what I'm going to run into, or this is what my opponent's planning to do. So you got to have a plan to prepare for that before it happens. Otherwise, you're pretty much up a hill without a paddle in terms of knowing what you're going to be able to pull off, what you're going to be able to do. So by that nature, the turn-based combat is a lot more cerebral and a lot more dependent on strategy rather than just kind of, because sometimes button mashing can come into play a little bit with real-time combat or different things of that nature. So the turn-based combat is tends to be a little bit more reserved for strategy type games or things of that nature. But the one MMORPG I've seen that pulls off fairly well, just because you're going to need a lot of content in order to be able to keep that game, keep a turn-based combat system from becoming really, really stagnant in your game, and Dupas actually pulls that off fairly well, which I'm glad to say. But the problem is, because it's such a grindy game where there's no way to level other than just grinding out the combat system, it has to have that. Otherwise, you're basically playing a game that doesn't change, that is incredibly stagnant in nature with its combat system, and without that huge amount of content that keeps the combat system actually flowing and working fairly well, then you're sitting on a dud that kind of just sits there and doesn't really provide anything for the players that are playing it, other than just, oh, I've gotta sit here and grind out forever in order to get anywhere or to unlock the newer games, the newer bosses or newer fights that I want to be a part of. And you're kind of locked into that, okay, I've got to just grind everything out. Which creates a system that's not really healthy for games where you feel like you're spending a lot of time just kind of not really getting anywhere. And that does create quite a few issues in terms of making sure that people are engaged in the game and are constantly coming back to play it, as compared to okay, I played it for a little while, it's just more the same over and over and over, so I don't want to play this game anymore because there's nothing really new for me to enjoy or to play, and by so doing, those kind of games really just fizzle out in terms of how they're available for what new content they bring or different things like that. And the games that are really successful with that are either very short or can constantly bring new things out onto the table for their players to enjoy. So let's see here. There we go. There's nothing wrong. Those games can be very enjoyable at times, but again, they get repetitive at times just because that's the nature of the combat system. Well, there is set I. So that's there for today. Again, later on I'll be going through set J and possibly through these special different puzzles, whatever they are, because I haven't gone through any of them yet. But for now, there is set I for you guys. If you like the video, please click the like button. If you want to be caught up to date when new set walkthroughs come out, please subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, you guys have a good day, and happy gaming.